On January 1st, 1999, 11 European currencies quietly agreed to disappear. The German mark, the French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, the Dutch guilder, the Portuguese escudo, the Finnish marca, the Austrian shilling, the Belgian franc, the Irish pound, and the Luxembourg franc. For decades, some of these were more than just pieces of paper. They were symbols of defeat and recovery, trauma and resilience, pride and paranoia. Entire generations measured their lives in these units: salaries, rents, savings, dowries, pensions. And then, in a single coordinated move, they were frozen in place, locked at fixed exchange rates and fused into something new. One currency, one interest rate, one central bank, and one enormous bet. Because that's what the euro really was at its birth. Not just a convenience for tourists or a technical upgrade for bankers, but a wager on whether countries with different histories, different debts, different levels of discipline, and very different political cultures could share the same money without sharing the same state. It was a decision to glue together the financial nervous systems of 11 nations and hope that somehow the rest of the body would follow. The paradox is simple. If money is supposed to reflect a nation's choices, what happens when many nations share one money but keep their own choices? To understand how Europe ended up here, with 11 currencies merging into one, and millions of people waking up in a monetary union they never directly voted on, you have to rewind. Not just to the 1990s, not just to Maastricht, but to the post-war trauma that gave birth to the dream of never again, and to Europe's long, uneasy love affair with fixed exchange rates and the illusion that rules can permanently tame politics. For most of the 20th century, European currencies were like soldiers in a permanent trench war, pegged, unpegged, devalued, revalued, packed into systems that were supposed to last forever and then collapsed on contact with reality. After World War II, the United States emerged with its factories intact, its gold reserves swollen, and the dollar sitting proudly at the center of the new Bretton Woods system. Most European currencies were pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. Stability, at least on paper, was restored. But in the background, Europe was thinking about something else. The continent had just torn itself apart twice in less than 50 years. Borders had moved, regimes had fallen, entire cities had been erased. Powerful people began to whisper a new idea. Maybe the only way to stop Europe from destroying itself again was to bind its economies so tightly together that war would become not just immoral, but mathematically irrational. The problem was, history kept getting in the way. When Bretton Woods finally broke down in the early 1970s, currencies were cut loose. The dollar floated. The old anchor disappeared. European currencies, suddenly freed from their dollar pegs, started to move against each other. Politicians hated it. Business leaders hated it. Trade across borders became more complicated. Speculators sniffed out weak spots. Crises multiplied. The dream of unity clashed with the reality of a currency market that treated every country as fair game. The first answer was the so-called snake in the tunnel, an early attempt to keep European exchange rates within narrow bands, all moving together against the dollar. The idea sounded elegant. The reality was chaos. The snake twisted, broke, reformed, and broke again. One country after another fell out. Some rejoined, some did not. The message was clear. As long as there were many currencies, there were many targets. That experiment morphed into the European monetary system and the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM. Again, the goal was the same. Keep currencies close together, create semi-fixed exchange rates, resist the chaos of fully floating money. On paper, it was a network of equals. In practice, everyone knew that one currency sat quietly at the center of the web. The German mark, Germany's post-war central bank. The Bundesbank had one sacred memory: Weimar hyperinflation. In the early 1920s, the mark had been printed into oblivion. People carried wages in wheelbarrows. Savings evaporated. Social order cracked. That trauma wrote itself into the German political DNA. Never again. Never again inflation like that. Never again a central bank that bowed to political pressure. Never again a currency that melted in your hand. The Bundesbank became obsessed with price stability, and it enforced that obsession with brutal consistency. If inflation threatened, it raised interest rates. If politicians complained, it ignored them. Over time, that discipline made the German mark the rock of Europe. Investors trusted it. Speculators feared it. Other European central banks quietly adjusted their policies to track it. If Germany raised rates, others followed. If Germany decided the mark would be strong, others paid the price with weaker exports and higher unemployment. The funny thing is that Europe already had a kind of central bank long before the euro existed. It was just located in Frankfurt, and it answered to one country. That's the first paradox of the euro's birth. It was partly an attempt to escape German dominance by asking Germany to share it. The emerging idea was simple and seductive. Take the stability of the German mark and wrap it in a European flag. Create a new central bank modeled on the Bundesbank. Bake German-style discipline into the rules from the beginning. Give France, Italy, Spain, and the others a permanent say in what used to be Germany's private monetary domain. Everybody wins. At least that was the theory. But money isn't just about rules, it's about behavior. You can copy the structure of the Bundesbank, you can copy its inflation target, you can even locate the new European Central Bank in Frankfurt as a symbolic gesture. What you can't copy so easily is the culture that made the old system work. That's where Maastricht enters the story. The Maastricht Treaty, signed in 1992, laid out the conditions for joining the new currency. Countries had to meet convergence criteria. Budget deficits were supposed to stay under 3% of GDP. Public debt should be under, or moving toward, 60% of GDP. Inflation had to be low and stable. Interest rates should converge. On paper, these were guardrails. In reality, they were psychological signals. They were meant to tell Germany, and countries like it, that future Euro members would behave in a disciplined way. They wouldn't use the common currency as a license to borrow without consequence. The trick is that numbers on paper can converge long before societies do. Governments massaged their figures. One-off measures were used to get deficits down just in time for inspection. Privatizations brought in temporary cash. Accounting acrobatics became a quiet art form in finance ministries. By the late 1990s, enough boxes were ticked. Enough numbers looked close enough. The political momentum was unstoppable. The bet was on. On January 1st, 1999, 11 countries fixed their exchange rates forever against a new unit, the euro. For 3 years, the euro existed mostly in the electronic world. People still paid with marks, francs, and lira. But behind the scenes, the prices were already being expressed in euros. Then, in 2002, physical notes and coins arrived. Old currencies were collected and destroyed. New notes, with anonymous bridges and windows instead of national heroes, slid into wallets. The connection between national identity and money was deliberately blurred. No kings, no poets, no generals. Just generic architecture from imaginary European bridges meant to represent unity without offending anyone in particular. The sales pitch was polished. The euro would eliminate exchange rate risk inside Europe, making trade easier and more predictable. It would reduce transaction costs. It would deepen financial markets. It would give Europe a currency strong enough to stand alongside the dollar. And it would make war between euro members not just unthinkable, but financially suicidal. Underneath all of that was something less poetic. The euro turned 11 national warning systems into one. Before, a country with rising deficits, low productivity, and political instability would see its currency punished. The exchange rate would fall. Investors would demand higher interest rates. Pressure would build to adjust. After the euro, that signal was muted. Investors looked at Greek, Italian, or Portuguese bonds and saw something almost indistinguishable from German ones. Same currency, same central bank, same apparent risk. Interest rates converged downward. For countries that had spent decades paying a premium to borrow, this was a revolution. Cheap credit flowed into housing, into public spending, into private consumption. Some of it funded real investment. Some of it fueled bubbles. All of it reinforced the illusion that Europe had finally transcended its old divides. The euro did something extraordinary. It hid old differences by covering them with new debt. The architects of the euro believed the shared currency would force discipline. If you can't devalue, you'll reform. If you can't print, you'll control your deficits. If you can't inflate away your debt, you'll restructure your economy. The constraint itself would create responsibility. In practice, the constraint created something else, a long fuse. The 2008 global financial crisis was the match. When U.S. housing markets imploded and banking systems across the world started to crack, Europe's weaknesses were suddenly exposed. Tax revenues collapsed, deficits exploded. Banks that had lent heavily into property bubbles, especially in places like Spain and Ireland, teetered on the edge. Governments had to step in, guaranteeing deposits, bailing out institutions, backstopping the system. In a country with its own currency, the central bank and the treasury can, in extreme circumstances, act together. They can print money, buy government bonds, suppress yields, and inflate away part of the debt burden. It's a dangerous tool, but it exists. Inside the euro, the situation was different. Governments didn't control the printing press anymore. The European Central Bank did. And the ECB had a mandate narrowly focused on price stability, not on saving over-indebted states. Investors finally asked the question they should have asked a decade earlier. If a government can't print its way out, can it default inside a monetary union? Bond yields on so-called peripheral countries soared. Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and later Italy found themselves paying punishing interest rates just to refinance their debts. The convergence story died overnight. What replaced it was brutal sorting. Safe in the north, risky in the south. The single currency had not prevented a crisis. It had redistributed and concentrated it. In Greece, the fairy tale turned into a morality play. Years of deficit spending, weak tax collection, and misreported statistics collided with a recession and a rigid currency. Pensions were cut, wages fell, taxes rose sharply, unemployment among young people exploded, public assets were sold off, Protests filled the streets. The abstract rules of Maastricht turned into concrete suffering. Meanwhile, countries like Germany and the Netherlands benefited from ultra-low borrowing costs and a currency that, for them, was weaker than the old mark would have been. Their export sectors thrived. Their trade surpluses grew. The same system that squeezed some economies provided a tailwind to others. The euro had delivered what its founders promised. It bound destinies together. What they underestimated was how unevenly the pain would be shared when things went wrong. At its core, the euro is an attempt to do with contracts and treaties what earlier empires tried to do with armies, lock different peoples into a shared fate so tightly that breaking away becomes too costly to contemplate. One money means shared risk. Shared risk, in theory, means shared responsibility. But responsibility is not evenly distributed. Neither is power. When crisis hit, it was not a European Parliament that decided what had to be cut in Athens or Lisbon or Madrid. It was a complex negotiation between national governments, European institutions, and the financial markets watching from the sidelines. The European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the International Monetary Fund became known as the Troika. They didn't just manage liquidity, they influenced policy, budget cuts, pension reforms, labor laws. Things that used to be decided by national elections were now shaped by the conditions of rescue programs. The euro had promised to depoliticize money. Instead, it repoliticized everything. History offers a grim warning here. Monetary unions without fully unified political structures have a short shelf life. The Latin Monetary Union in the 19th century tried to harmonize coinage across France, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland, and others. It collapsed under the strain of cheating and unilateral debasement. The Scandinavian Monetary Union brought together Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under a shared currency standard. It fell apart when national interests diverged and war intervened. Fixed exchange rate systems like the classical gold standard and Bretton Woods claimed permanence, only to fracture when governments faced the choice between domestic pain and external rules. The euro's designers knew this history. They tried to avoid its mistakes by creating an independent central bank, tough entry criteria, and later rules like the Stability and Growth Pact to limit deficits even after joining. But rules are only as strong as the political will to enforce them. And political will wavers when unemployment rises, when elections loom, when streets fill with angry people holding signs instead of shopping bags. The danger for the euro isn't just another dramatic crisis where cameras capture bank runs and emergency summits. It's something slower, decades of uneven growth, simmering resentment, and the quiet normalization of permanent austerity in some places, and permanent surplus in others. A continent where a single currency coexists with deepening psychological divides about who pays and who benefits. Yet, despite everything, the euro endures. It is still one of the world's key reserve currencies. It still simplifies trade for hundreds of millions of people. It still fills wallets from Lisbon to Helsinki. New members have even joined since the original 11, convinced that the benefits of belonging outweigh the dangers of staying outside. That tells you something important. The euro is not just economics. It's a story about a continent that destroyed itself twice and decided to bind its economies together so tightly that another self-destruction would be too costly to bear. A story about fear of inflation in the north, fear of instability in the south, and fear of irrelevance everywhere. A story where governments bet that if they created a shared money first, a shared political identity would eventually grow around it. Maybe that bet will pay off. Maybe the euro will someday sit at the core of a truly federal Europe, with a shared budget, shared taxes, and shared democratic control over spending, the way the dollar sits inside a federal United States. Or maybe the euro will remain what it was at birth, a brilliant, risky attempt to jump ahead of history, keeping one foot in national politics and the other foot in a supranational monetary project that demands more unity than voters are ready to give. Because beneath every technical explanation, every treaty clause, every central bank press conference, the same basic truth remains. Every currency is a story about trust. Trust that the rules will be followed. Trust that others will carry their share of the burden. Trust that when the next crisis hits, the system will bend instead of shatter. The euro's birth took 11 different stories of money, with their own traumas and triumphs, and forced them into one narrative. It erased national symbols from banknotes, but could not erase national memories from minds. German memories of hyperinflation, Italian memories of chronic devaluation, French memories of sovereignty battles with Germany, Greek memories of occupation, dictatorship, and later, external control over domestic policy. Those old currencies may be gone, but they still speak. Not in the supermarket, but in debates about budgets. Not at the ATM, but at the ballot box. Not in exchange rate charts, but in anger over who must tighten their belts and who seems to profit from the tightening. The euro was a bet that shared money would create shared destiny. In many ways, it has. The question that still hangs over Europe is whether that shared destiny will feel like a community or a contract. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.